The human mocked by alien royalty. The grand hall of the Threxian palace was filled with laughter. Golden pillars stretched high into the ceiling, reflecting the glow of the twin moons outside. Alien nobles, dressed in shimmering robes, gathered around the central throne where King Sci-Fi sat. His 3 daughters, Zira, Vela, and Lizara, stood before him, their expressions full of amusement. At the center of the hall, surrounded by towering alien guards, stood a lone human, Captain Elias Carter. His hands were bound in metal cuffs, his uniform torn from battle. Despite his injuries, he stood tall, his gaze steady. Zira, the eldest sister, smirked. She had sharp features and violet skin, her piercing silver eyes full of mockery. "So this is the great human warrior," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "He looks fragile." Vela, the middle sister, chuckled. She had deep blue skin, her golden hair woven into braids. "I have seen servants with more strength than him," she added. "Father, why waste time with such a weak creature?" Lizara, the youngest and most playful, giggled. She had soft pink skin and glowing green eyes. "Perhaps he is just lost. A little human boy who wandered into the wrong part of the galaxy." The court erupted in laughter. Elias clenched his jaw but remained silent. He had faced worse than insults. He had been through wars, through hell, and he had survived. But this was just a game for them. The king raised his hand, and the laughter stopped. He studied Elias with a curious expression. "Human," he said in a deep voice, "you are the first of your kind to step into this palace. Your people are new to the stars, yet you challenge those who have ruled for 1,000 years. Tell me, why should we not see you as a joke?" Elias met the king's gaze without fear. "Because a joke doesn't survive," he said. His voice was calm, steady. "A joke doesn't fight back, and a joke doesn't stand here, in front of you, alive." There was a brief silence. A few nobles exchanged glances. The king's lips curled into a small, amused smile, but before he could speak, Zira stepped forward. "Then prove it," she said. "Let's play a game, little human." She turned to the crowd. "We give him one night in the wilds of Sci-Fi, the death planet. If he is truly strong, he will return alive." The nobles murmured in excitement. Sci-Fi was a world filled with nightmarish creatures, deadly landscapes, and violent storms. No outsider had ever survived there. Vela grinned. "Oh, I like this idea. It will be fun to watch him fail." Lizara smirked. "I bet he won't even last an hour." Elias did not flinch. He had heard enough alien arrogance in the past. He had fought in battles where he was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. Yet he had always found a way to survive. The king's eyes glowed with intrigue. He leaned forward. "Very well," he said. "The human will face Sci-Fi. If he survives, he earns our respect. If not, then the galaxy will know that humans are nothing but a weak, dying race." A cheer erupted from the crowd. Elias only gave a small nod. "Fine," he said. "But when I return, I hope you're ready to listen." Zira laughed. "Oh, little human, if you return, I will personally apologize." Elias smirked. "I'll remember that." As the guards dragged him away, the sisters continued to laugh, convinced that by sunrise, the human would be dead. But King Sci-Fi watched in silence. He saw something in the human's eyes that his daughters did not. Something dangerous, something different. And for the first time in many years, the Threxian king felt curious. The impossible survival. The cold wind howled across the barren landscape of Sci-Fi, the death planet. The twin moons cast a pale glow over the jagged cliffs and blackened soil. Strange, twisted trees stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Every shadow hid something deadly. Captain Elias Carter stood alone, his hands free now that the guards had thrown him from their ship and taken off, leaving him to die. He took a deep breath, scanning his surroundings. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. This place was not just a test, it was a death sentence. But he was not afraid. He had survived worse. The sisters watch and wait. Back in the Threxian palace, Zira, Vela, and Lizara watched the live feed of the planet from a grand viewing room. A massive holographic screen projected Elias's every movement. The nobles gathered, eagerly waiting for the moment that the human would fail. "This won't take long," Vela said, leaning back in her chair. "The creatures of Exatharn will tear him apart." Lizara giggled. "Or maybe he'll fall into a sinkhole first. That would be funnier." Zira remained silent, watching the screen carefully. The human was moving differently than she expected, not with panic, not with fear, but with purpose. She frowned. "He's not running blindly. He's tracking something." The other two sisters turned to the screen, confused. The hunt begins. Elias had one rule when it came to unknown environments: never run. Observe. Adapt. Survive. He crouched low, scanning the ground. The soil was soft. Something large had moved through here recently. A predator. Good. That meant food and resources were nearby. A deep growl rumbled behind him. Slowly, Elias turned. Glowing red eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by razor-sharp fangs dripping with saliva. The beast was a Xatharn stalker, a nightmare-given flesh, its thick, armored body twice the size of a lion, its claws capable of tearing through steel. A lesser man would have panicked. Elias only smiled. A predator meets its match. The stalker lunged. Elias rolled to the side, feeling the wind from the creature's massive claws swipe past his head. He landed in a crouch, gripping a sharp rock he had pocketed earlier. A weapon. A tool. The stalker turned, snarling. It was used to easy prey. But Elias Carter was not prey. The beast attacked again, jaws snapping. Elias dodged and drove the sharp rock into the creature's soft underbelly, just below the thick plating. The stalker howled in pain, staggering back. Elias didn't stop. He leaped onto its back, wrapping his arms around its thick neck. With all his strength, he yanked its head to the side, exposing the vulnerable spine. Then, using the beast's own momentum, he snapped its neck with a brutal twist. Silence fell. The monstrous predator collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Elias stepped back, breathing heavily. Blood stained his hands, but he had no time to rest. The creature's hide could be used as armor. Its bones could be weapons. Its flesh could keep him alive. He got to work. The palace grows silent. Back in the viewing room, the laughter stopped. The nobles watched in horrified silence as Elias skinned the dead beast, wrapping its hide around his body for protection. He fashioned a crude spear from its bones and collected its fangs for tools. Vela's face paled. He killed it. Lizara, who had been laughing moments ago, swallowed hard. That was luck, right? Zira said nothing, her sharp silver eyes fixed on the screen. She had fought in Threxian wars. She had trained with elite warriors, and yet, even she had never seen anyone move like that. The human had fought with precision, with strategy, as if he had planned the entire fight in seconds. "He's not just surviving," she murmured. "He's thriving. The night brings new horrors." Elias did not stop. He could already hear more creatures approaching, drawn by the scent of blood. He needed a shelter. With his spear in hand, he moved quickly, searching for higher ground. Soon, he spotted a cave nestled between two cliffs. It was risky. Caves could hold worse things than the outside world. But he had no choice. As he approached, a strange glow flickered inside. Elias tightened his grip on his spear. He was not alone. Slowly, he stepped inside, ready for another fight. The king watches. Far away, King Salthar sat alone in his chamber, watching the humans' progress on a private screen. The nobles had lost interest hours ago, expecting the human to fail. But Salthar remained, because he knew something they did not. The human was not just surviving. He was adapting, learning, conquering. The king leaned back, stroking his chin in thought. His daughters had laughed at the human. But Sci-Fi, he saw something else, something dangerous. And for the first time in centuries, the Threxian king felt something close to fear. The bet that changes everything. The Threxian palace was quiet. For the first time in history, a human had survived the death planet. The nobles who had once laughed at Elias Carter now spoke in hushed whispers, unable to believe what they had seen. In the royal viewing chamber, the three Threxian princesses sat in stunned silence. The massive holographic screen still displayed Elias, standing atop the corpse of a second slain beast, his face streaked with dirt and blood. The human was alive, unbroken, and more than that. He had conquered the wilds of Exotharn. Vela clenched her fists. This is impossible. Lizara, for once, had no clever remark. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared at the screen. But it was Zira who spoke first. Perhaps we underestimated him. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. King Salthar leaned forward in his throne, his golden eyes gleaming with interest. Human, he said into the palace's communicator, his voice projecting into the cold night of Exotharn, where Elias was being retrieved by Threxian warriors. Elias, standing tall despite his exhaustion, turned his head toward the holographic image of the king that appeared before him. "You have proven yourself," the king admitted. "Few beings survive that place, yet you did. And not by luck." Elias smirked. "I told you. I'm no joke." The king chuckled. "No, you are not." Then his expression turned sharp. "But now, I have a question. You have survived, but can you fight?" Elias wiped blood from his brow and shrugged. "Try me." A murmur went through the noble court. The king's eyes flickered toward his daughters. "Zyra, Vela, Lizara, it seems you were wrong about the human. Perhaps it is time to test him properly." Zyra stepped forward. "What do you suggest, father?" The king's lips curled into a smile. "A duel. The challenge." The next evening, the royal arena was filled with spectators. Threxians from across the empire had gathered, their golden armor gleaming under the artificial sun that hovered above the massive Colosseum. The air was thick with tension. At the center of the grand arena stood Elias Carter, dressed in light Threxian battle armor. His human-made knife was strapped to his leg, but his only weapon was a short Threxian sword, blunt at the edges, meant for testing rather than killing. Across from him stood Zorvok, the undefeated champion of the royal court, a Threxian warrior nearly 10 feet tall, his massive body rippled with muscle. His golden battle spear gleamed in the light. Elias rolled his shoulders, studying his opponent. He had faced vigor, but never faster, never smarter. The king's voice echoed across the arena. "This duel is simple. If the human wins, he earns the respect of the empire." His golden gaze shifted toward his daughters. "And if he loses, then my daughter's original judgment was correct. Humans are weak." Zyra smirked, her arms crossed. Vela grinned, confident. Lizara, however, had a flicker of doubt in her emerald eyes. The king raised his hand. "Begin. A battle of strength versus strategy." Zorvok charged. The ground shook beneath his massive steps. He was faster than he looked, his spear lunging toward Elias like a flash of lightning. Elias barely dodged, rolling to the side. The tip of the spear scraped his armor, nearly piercing through. He had no time to think, only react. The Threxian warrior came at him again, swinging his spear like a hammer. Elias ducked low, sliding under Zorvok's legs, slashing his sword at the alien's exposed ankle. The crowd gasped as blood splattered the sand. Zorvok stumbled, but he did not fall. He let out a roar, spinning around with his spear, forcing Elias to jump back. Elias exhaled, calculating. This wasn't a battle of strength. If it was, he would lose instantly. This was a battle of endurance, A battle of human willpower. Zorvok charged again, but this time Elias was ready. He let the warrior come close, too close. Then, at the last second, he sidestepped and plunged his sword into Zorvok's thigh. The warrior howled, staggering back. Blood dripped onto the sand. The crowd fell silent. Elias held his ground, breathing hard. His arms ached. His legs burned. But he wasn't done yet. Zorvok growled, gripping his spear tighter. He lunged again, slower this time. The wounds were taking their toll. Elias dodged once more and, using his smaller size, climbed onto Zorvok's back, locking his arm around the warrior's throat. Zorvok struggled, but Elias held on like a vice. He tightened his grip, cutting off the warrior's air supply. The Threxian's movements slowed. His eyes rolled back. And then he collapsed. The crowd erupted in shock. The aftermath. Elias stood, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. His body was covered in sweat and blood, but he was still standing. Zorvok, the undefeated champion, lay unconscious at his feet. The king stood from his throne, watching the human with newfound respect. Zera's smirk had vanished. Vela's eyes were wide with disbelief. Lysara, her lips parted slightly, as if seeing the human for the first time. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow. He turned toward the royal platform and locked eyes with the three sisters. "You said humans were weak," he called out, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Say it again." The arena fell into absolute silence. Zera clenched her jaw. Vela looked away. Lysara hesitated. Then the king chuckled. "I believe," he said, "that my daughters owe you something, Captain Carter." Elias smirked. The bet had changed everything. And the game had only just begun. The king's command. The Threxian royal arena still echoed with the memory of Elias Carter's victory. The nobles who had once mocked the human now murmured in disbelief. The arena floor, once bathed in golden light, was now stained with Threxian blood. The blood of Zorvok, the undefeated champion who had fallen to a human. But the true battle was only beginning. Atop his golden throne, King Xalthar observed the human warrior with narrowed eyes. He had expected Elias to put up a fight, but not to win. Not to outthink and outmaneuver one of the greatest warriors in the empire. The king's command. The Threxian royal arena still echoed with the memory of Elias Carter's victory. The nobles who had once mocked the human now murmured in disbelief. The arena floor, once bathed in golden light, was now stained with Threxian blood, the blood of Zorvok, the undefeated champion who had fallen to a human. But the true battle was only beginning. Atop his golden throne, King Xalthar observed the human warrior with narrowed eyes. He had expected Elias to put up a fight, but not to win. Not to outthink and outmaneuver one of the greatest warriors in the empire. His daughters stood beside him, their expressions mixed with shock, frustration, and something else. Something dangerous. "Father," Zera began, her voice controlled but sharp, "this proves nothing. The human has won." The king's voice silenced the entire court. He leaned forward, his glowing golden eyes locking onto Elias, who still stood in the arena, breathless but victorious. "Humans are unexpected." The king's tone was thoughtful, resilient, clever. He tapped his fingers against the armrest of his throne, deep in thought. Then, suddenly, he let out a booming laugh. "Very well," he declared. "Elias Carter, you have proven your worth." Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, rolling his shoulders. "Glad to hear it. Now does that mean I can go home?" The king's smile widened. "No." A hush fell over the court. Elias's smirk faded slightly. "Excuse me." The king stood, his towering form casting a shadow over the throne room. "You have humiliated my daughters. You have shamed my nobles. And you have shown me something unexpected." He turned toward his daughters, who all stiffened. "You will not return to your home, Elias Carter. The human narrowed his eyes. Then what do you want? The king's next words shook the entire empire. You will marry my daughters. The shockwave through the court. The moment those words left the king's mouth, the court erupted in chaos. Nobles shouted in disbelief. Some gasped, others laughed, until they realized the king was not joking. Elias stared. I'm sorry. What? Zyra, Vela, and Lysara all turned to their father in horror. Father, Vela shouted, you cannot be serious. Lysara paled. You want us to marry him? Even Zyra, usually composed, tightened her fists. This is madness. He is a human. The king's voice silenced them all. I am the ruler of this empire, and my word is law. His golden eyes gleamed as he gazed at Elias. I have seen many warriors in my time, but none have ever humiliated my daughters as you have. He turned to the three sisters. You called him weak. You mocked his existence. Yet here he stands, having bested your strongest warrior. He gestured toward Elias. If he is so inferior, then why are you standing here, unable to look him in the eye? The sisters said nothing. King Salthar continued. The empire must learn. Strength comes in many forms, and if this human truly is weak, then you, my daughters, will break him yourselves. His smile turned cold. Unless, of course, you fear he is stronger than you imagined. The words hit the princesses like a weapon. Elias folded his arms, still trying to process what was happening. So let me get this straight. Your brilliant plan is to force your daughters to marry me, as some kind of lesson. The king's smile widened. Exactly. Zyra took a sharp step forward, her eyes burning with fury. Fine, she spat. But understand this, human. Her voice was a dagger, her silver eyes cold. You may have won today, but you will regret ever stepping into our world. Vela grinned, but it wasn't kind, it was predatory. Oh, I look forward to watching you fail. Lysara, however, did not speak. Her green eyes flickered with something more complicated. Elias sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fantastic. Just what I always wanted. 3 wives who hate me. The king chuckled. Then prove them wrong. A game of survival. This time in the palace. Within hours, the arrangements were made. Elias was given quarters within the palace, but they were anything but comfortable. He wasn't treated as an honored guest. No, he was treated as an intruder. The sisters were not pleased with their new reality, and they made sure he knew it. His first night, Zyra had his entire room filled with ice-cold mist, making it nearly impossible to sleep. The second night, Vela arranged for a friendly sparring match, which turned into a brutal endurance test, where he was expected to fight Threxian warriors for hours. The third night, Lysara tricked him into eating a spice so hot it could burn through metal. Each day, the challenges grew worse. Each day, they tested him. Each day, Elias refused to break. The sisters watched him struggle, expecting him to give up. But instead, he only grew stronger. The first crack. One evening, after another brutal day of Vela's combat drills, Elias sat outside the palace on a high balcony, looking out at the twin moons. He heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned to see Lysara. She wasn't mocking him. She wasn't smiling. Instead, she looked curious. You don't belong here, she said quietly. Elias smirked. Yeah, tell me something I don't know. She hesitated, then sat beside him. Why haven't you tried to escape? Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled. Because if I run, they'll always think they were right about me. He glanced at her. And that would be really annoying. Lysara studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she let out a small laugh. It was the first time any of the sisters had laughed without malice, and Elias knew, in that moment, the game was changing. The trials of marriage. The Threxian palace had become a battlefield. Not of swords, not of blasters, but of wills. Elias Carter was no fool. He knew that despite the grand halls, the golden decorations, and the luxurious rooms, he was still in enemy territory. The three Phyrexian princesses, Zira, Vela, and Lizara, wanted him gone. But Elias had survived Oxotharn. He had defeated Zorbok, and now he was standing in the middle of the most dangerous war of all. A war of marriage. Day 1. Zira's political trap. Zira, the eldest sister, was the most dangerous in a different way. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a strategist, a politician, a queen in the making. She did not throw punches. She threw laws and traditions. Elias woke up to find 100 diplomatic scrolls piled on his table. "What is this?" he asked, rubbing his temple. Zira, standing tall in her royal robes, smirked. "Your duties as my husband." Elias frowned. "I never agreed to this." Zira tilted her head. "Ah, but by Phyrexian law, you did. As my mate, you are required to oversee political treaties, formal engagements, and the stability of our empire." She leaned in, her silver eyes glinting. "Unless, of course, you are not capable." It was a trap. If Elias backed down, she would call him weak. If he accepted, she would drown him in endless bureaucracy until he surrendered. Elias sat down, cracked his knuckles, and smirked. "You want me to read all this? Fine, but don't expect me to sit quietly." And with that, he began rewriting Phyrexian diplomatic agreements the human way, cutting through pointless negotiations, exposing lies hidden in contracts, and countering Zira's every move. By sunset, Zira stared at him with a new kind of frustration. Elias grinned. "What's wrong? I thought you liked politics." Zira exhaled through her nose. "This is going to be harder than I thought." Day 3. Vela's physical challenge. If Zira was the mind, then Vela was the muscle. She was the warrior princess, the general of the empire's most elite army. She despised weakness, and she refused to accept a mate who wasn't stronger than her warriors. So she set the ultimate challenge. "Every morning, my soldiers and I train for 5 hours," she said, arms crossed. "If you want to stay here, you will train with us." Elias raised a brow. 5 hours? That's a bit excessive. Vela grinned. "What? Human? Can't handle it." Elias sighed and rolled his shoulders. "Fine. Let's do this." The first session nearly killed him. Vela didn't just train, she broke men. Her warriors were used to intense gravity training, pain resistance drills, and energy shield combat. Elias was thrown into Phyrexian endurance tests meant to push warriors to their absolute limits. By the end of the session, his muscles burned, his body ached, and his legs felt like lead. But he did not stop. Vela watched with a mixture of amusement and curiosity as Elias gritted his teeth and pushed forward, refusing to surrender even when the Phyrexian warriors collapsed before him. By the third day, Vela sat beside him in the training ground, sweat dripping down her face. "You're insane." Elias grinned, wiping dirt from his face. "You started this." Vela smirked, then stood. "Fine. I admit, you're not as pathetic as I thought." Elias chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." Day 5. Lizara's mind games. Lizara was the most unpredictable of the three. She wasn't a warrior like Vela or a politician like Zira. She was a manipulator. She played with words, emotions, and illusions. If she couldn't break Elias physically, she would break him mentally. "You're getting comfortable," she said one night, lounging on a balcony beside him. "You think you're winning." Elias glanced at her. "I don't think anything. I just take it one day at a time." Lizara smirked. "Do you know why our father chose you?" Elias shrugged. "Because I annoyed him." She chuckled. "No, because he wants to test us. He wants to see if we will break you, or if you will change us." Elias fell silent. Lizara's voice turned soft, almost hypnotic. "You don't belong here, Elias. You don't even want to be here. "So, why are you fighting so hard?" Elias sighed, staring at the twin moons. "Because running is easy." He turned to her, his expression serious. "And I don't like easy." For once, Lizara had no reply. The first shift. The days turned to weeks. Elias never stopped fighting back. He outplayed Zyra's politics. He endured Vela's training. He matched Lizara's mind games. And something changed. The sisters stopped treating him like an enemy. They still challenged him. They still tested him. But it wasn't about breaking him anymore. It was about understanding him. One night, Elias sat at the royal dining hall, eating with them for the first time without hostility. Zyra discussed tactics with him. Vela laughed at his sarcasm. Lizara watched him with something softer in her gaze. For the first time, they were not just enemies. And King Zalfar, watching from his throne, smiled. Because the game had only just begun. The dark conspiracy. For the first time since Elias Carter had stepped into the Threxian Empire, the palace no longer felt like a battlefield. The three princesses, Zyra, Vela, and Lizara, had stopped trying to break him. The endless challenges had become something else, a silent test to see how much he could endure. And much to their growing frustration and admiration, he endured everything. Yet beneath the surface of their games, something darker lurked. A secret watching from the shadows. A threat that wanted Elias dead. The assassination attempt. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Elias had finally convinced Vela to take a night off from training. Zyra had gone to a late political council. Lizara had retreated to her chambers, lost in thought. Elias sat alone on the outer palace balcony, enjoying the rare moment of peace. The twin moons cast a soft silver glow over the city beyond. And for once, he allowed himself to breathe. Then he heard it. A shift in the wind. A whisper of movement. Elias turned, too late. A dark figure lunged from the shadows, blade glinting in the moonlight. Elias reacted on pure instinct. He twisted, barely dodging the fatal strike. The blade sliced across his side, tearing fabric and drawing blood. A sharp pain flared, but he had no time to think. The assassin moved fast, too fast. Elias rolled, reaching for his knife, but another figure landed behind him. A second assassin. Shit. The fight for survival. The first assassin attacked again, aiming for Elias's neck. Elias barely blocked it, grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting. The assassin grunted, but the second one was already on him, sweeping his legs from under him. Elias hit the ground hard. His ribs screamed in pain, but he didn't stop moving. He rolled just in time to avoid a dagger plunging into his chest. Using his momentum, he kicked upward, slamming his boot into the second assassin's knee. A sickening crack echoed through the night, followed by a pained grunt. One down. But the first assassin was already coming at him again. Elias grabbed a broken piece of palace railing, the jagged edge sharp enough to be deadly. The assassin lunged, but Elias sidestepped and drove the shard straight into their gut. The figure staggered back, choking, before collapsing. Silence fell. Elias stood panting, blood dripping from his side, his hands shaking from adrenaline. Then, the palace alarms erupted. The aftermath. Guards arrived seconds too late, surrounding the scene with their weapons drawn. But it wasn't the guards Elias focused on. It was Zyra, Vela, and Lizara. They stood at the entrance to the balcony, eyes wide as they took in the scene. The blood, the assassins, and Elias, standing in the middle of it all. Lizara was the first to move. She ran to Elias, her hands hovering over his bleeding side. "You're hurt." Elias gave a weak smirk. "You should see the other guys." Vela stepped forward, her eyes burning with fury. "Who did this?" Elias took a deep breath. "They were Threxian trained," he said, his mind already working through the details. "They move like your elite warriors. This wasn't some random assassination. Someone inside the palace wants me dead." Zyra's jaw tightened. Then we have a traitor. Lizara exchanged a glance with her sisters. No, not just a traitor. Her voice was quiet but sharp. A conspiracy. The king's fury. King Salfar was not pleased. The next morning, the entire palace was on lockdown. The royal guards interrogated every noble, warrior, and servant. No one was above suspicion. The king paced inside his war chamber, his golden eyes flickering with barely controlled rage. "I made you my daughter's husband," he said, his deep voice calm but dangerous. "I gave you a place in my empire." He turned to Elias. "And someone wants to take that from you." Elias crossed his arms. "Not just from me. From you." Zara stepped forward, her sharp silver eyes analyzing every possibility. This wasn't just an assassination. This was a message. Vela's hands clenched into fists. "Someone in our own ranks is working against us." Lizara was quiet, her green eyes flickering with thought. Then she exhaled, her voice barely a whisper. "This is bigger than Elias." Elias raised a brow. "You think it's about something else?" She nodded. "Assassinations in the royal palace. It's an act of war." The king went silent. Then, finally, he spoke. "Then we must prepare. Enemies in the dark." That night, Elias sat in his chambers, his mind restless. The sisters had changed. They had stopped fighting against him. Now, they were fighting beside him. There was no more doubt. Someone wanted him dead. Not because he was a threat, but because his presence was changing the empire. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Zara standing there, arms crossed, a rare moment of hesitation in her expression. "What is it?" Elias asked. Zara's silver eyes studied him. "I've spent my life thinking humans were weak," she said quietly, "that they had no place among the stars." Elias smirked. "And now?" She exhaled. "Now, I'm starting to think you were right." Elias leaned back, crossing his arms. "About what?" Zara's lips curled into something dangerously close to admiration. "Humans are not a joke." Elias chuckled. "Took you long enough." She rolled her eyes. "Don't get used to it." Then, before he could respond, she turned and left, the door sliding shut behind her. Elias stared after her for a long moment. For the first time, the sisters weren't just tolerating him. They were starting to trust him. But trust wouldn't matter if they couldn't survive what was coming next, because whoever was behind this attack wasn't done yet. And the next time, they wouldn't miss. The final choice. The Threxian palace was no longer just a place of luxury and power. It had become a battlefield in waiting. The assassination attempt on Elias Carter had been only the beginning. The shadows whispered of war, of betrayal, of an enemy lurking within the empire itself. And now, Elias was no longer just a human warrior forced into marriage with 3 alien princesses. He was a target. But Elias Carter had never been the kind of man to run from a fight. Not when his survival meant something. Not when the 3 women who had once hated him now stood at his side. The enemy reveals itself. The attack came at dawn. Elias had barely gotten a few hours of sleep when the palace shook with explosions. The alarms screamed. The halls filled with panicked guards, their weapons drawn as they raced toward the outer gates. Elias grabbed his blade and sidearm, bolting toward the royal war chamber. He wasn't the only one. By the time he arrived, Zara, Vela, and Lizara were already inside, standing in front of a massive war table displaying a holographic map of the palace grounds. Zara's face was grim. "We have a problem." Elias scanned the map. He could see red markers blinking along the palace walls. Enemy forces, breaching the outer defenses. Vela punched the table. They got through the perimeter without setting off the outer alarm grid. That means they had inside help. Elias finished. His jaw tightened. This isn't just an attack. This is a coup. Lizara nodded. Her face was unusually serious, the usual playfulness gone. "Someone in our ranks has been waiting for this moment." She gestured toward the map. They're not just trying to kill you anymore, Elias. They want to take the throne. The realization settled over the room like a weight. This wasn't just about Elias. This was about the entire empire. The betrayal. The doors slammed open, and a squad of royal guards rushed in. Leading them was a familiar figure, General Kevar, one of King Zalfar's most trusted military commanders. Or at least, he had been. Now his face was cold, expressionless. Elias immediately knew something was wrong. Kevar bowed his head slightly. Princesses, Carter. His voice was calm, too calm. By order of the Royal Council, you are to be taken into custody, effective immediately. Vela's fists clenched. Custody? On what charge? Kevar's golden eyes flicked toward Elias. For bringing a human into the empire. For weakening the throne. Elias exhaled sharply. Let me guess, he said, stepping forward. This royal council of yours decided that the empire would be better off without me. Kevar's lips curled into a smirk. You were never meant to survive. Human, your existence has made the empire unstable. It is time to set things right. Zira moved first. In one smooth motion, she grabbed the dagger from her belt and threw it straight at Kevar's head. Kevar dodged at the last second, the blade grazing his cheek. His guards raised their weapons, but before they could fire, Vela and Lizara were already in motion. The war chamber erupted into chaos. The battle for the throne. Elias dove for cover as energy blasts exploded around the room. The sisters fought like demons, their blades flashing in the dim light. Zira moved like a tactician, taking down enemies with precise, lethal strikes. Vela was a storm, using her sheer strength to tear through the enemy ranks. Lizara was a shadow, slipping between enemies like a ghost, striking where they least expected. And Elias fought like a human. Brutal, efficient, unpredictable. He grabbed a fallen guard's rifle, rolled behind cover, and returned fire. His shots weren't as precise as the sisters, but they didn't need to be. He aimed for disruption, confusion, distraction, anything to keep the enemy off balance. Within minutes, the enemy forces were in retreat, but Kevar was nowhere to be seen. Elias turned to Zira. We need to find him. She nodded, agreed. If we don't stop him now, this war doesn't end. Vela cracked her knuckles. Then let's finish this. The final confrontation. They found Kevar in the throne room. He stood before the golden throne, his back straight, his sword drawn. The room was empty except for him. As Elias and the sisters stepped inside, he turned, his expression calm, almost amused. You fought well, Kevar admitted, but you don't understand. Elias raised a brow. Enlighten me. Kevar tilted his head. This empire has stood for 1,000 years. The moment a human stepped foot into this palace, you changed it. You made the princesses question tradition. You made the king doubt the old ways. Elias smirked. And that scares you, doesn't it? Kevar's eyes darkened. The empire does not need change. He gripped his sword tighter. It needs correction. Then he attacked. The fight was fast, brutal. Elias dodged the first strike, barely blocking the second. Kevar was faster than Zorvok, stronger than the assassins. But Elias had one advantage. He wasn't fighting alone. Zira, Vela, and Lizara struck together. Zira's blade clashed against Kevar's, forcing him back. Vela's fists slammed into his ribs, breaking his stance. Lizara's dagger sliced across his arm, making him drop his weapon. And Elias finished it. With one final move, he drove his own blade into Kevar's chest. The general staggered. He looked down at the blade, then back at Elias. So this is how it ends, he murmured. Elias pulled the blade free, stepping back. Yeah, his voice was quiet. It is. Kevar collapsed. It was over. A new beginning. The coup had failed. By sunrise, the remaining traitors were rounded up. The empire was secured once more. But something had changed. Elias wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was part of the empire. The three princesses, once his enemies, now stood beside him not just by order, but by choice. And as he stood before King Salfar, who watched him with something dangerously close to pride, Elias knew. He had done the impossible. He had gone from being a joke to being a legend. And the Threxian Empire would never be the same again.